Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world, and welcome to today's SecurityBoulevard.com webinar, brought to you by TechStrong and Menlo Security. My name is Cody J. Brown. I'm the host of TechStrong Learning. We have an exciting presentation ahead of us, but first I have just a couple of housekeeping notes. First off, today's session is being recorded, so if you miss any of our discussion or you'd like to rewatch or share, the on-demand recording will be made available shortly after we conclude our live webinar today. If you have any questions for our speaker, we'd like you to go ahead and submit those using the Q&A tab on the right side of your screen. And if you have any additional comments or anything you'd like to add to our conversation, we want you to use the chat tab for those. We also have a couple of handouts available on the Handouts tab. Those will aid in following along in today's presentation. And at the conclusion of our webinar, we will be giving away 4 $25 Amazon gift cards. So be sure to stick around. So our topic today is solving the work anywhere and access everything security challenge. And I'm joined today by Eric Schwacke, Senior Manager of Cybersecurity Strategy at Menlo Security. Eric, thank you so much for being here with us today. I'm going to go ahead and turn the floor over to you.
Hey, thanks a lot, Cody. And thanks for everybody who's taking the time out of your day to spend some time with us. I hope this is going to be some great information for you to understand a little bit about how Menlo can help you tackle ZTNA programs you might have in place. Obviously, that's something the ZTNA, Zero Trust Network Access, is something a lot of companies are sort of thinking about, trying to implement. And so hopefully after you've had some time with us today, you'll get a sense of where Menlo can help you with that. So when we talk about ZTNA, obviously the first thing we like to talk about is sort of how the world has changed. This probably isn't new information for many folks on the call, but I'd like to sort of level set and talk about where the world was and where it's currently going and at. Back in the day, of course, when users were trying to access your organization's applications and the data that those applications had access to, obviously, a lot of that connection was done directly at headquarters. You had folks that were tied in directly to either a headquarters Wi-Fi or a headquarters hardwire. They had direct access to the applications and data they needed to do their jobs. If they were remote, which was, not as many folks were remote back then, but the folks that were remote, same idea. They would connect to that same information through a VPN, and they would just, log in through their laptop, connect to the VPN, and get access to the information they needed. What we saw, sort of progressed from that, is how data applications became what was considered the new perimeter. And sort of this is the start of that digital transformation, that's sort of that buzzword that everybody uses, but it's one of these things that you're probably going through in your organization of, how can we make our applications easier to use? And one of the ways you can do that is you can move that application off into the cloud. And obviously the cloud is sort of where everything exists, from the internet, everything else, but you can obviously move your applications and data from the cloud as well. Now, that was great. Of course, it still is the same idea with that change in how data was being siloed off into the cloud, where even if you were an on-premise user, you'd still connect in, through the network, through the firewalls, all that other stuff, then go out of that back up into the cloud to get the information applications you needed to do your job. For your VPN users, your remote users, it was a little more, much more cumbersome actually for them, because again, same idea for them. They would VPN in to the headquarters location to then be rerouted out back and access the information through the cloud. So there was this shift there, but still very sort of localized and centralized around what was happening within a headquarters or data center location. And now we're seeing obviously a big shift in all of this. We see that, many users are now not at the office anymore. They don't want to connect through the office to do their job. So they want to have direct access to not only internet, of course, but they also want direct access to applications and data that might be in the organization's cloud or even in the organization's headquarters and data center. They still want to have easy access to all that, which is what we're sort of going towards. And we're seeing that transition happen quite a bit with the organizations we talk to, is that they're moving to this sort of very decentralized approach with users as that new perimeter. The user themselves becomes the sort of choke point for all of these things. Now, what we think of at Menlo is that, okay, you're going to be working in the cloud. You're going to be going, not going to be going back through the corporate headquarters, the castle moat approach anymore. So what we think of at Menlo is that all this communication should go through some security stack. And at Menlo Security, all of that communication goes through the Menlo Security Cloud. So whether it's just going to the internet to browse Facebook, or whether it's going up to access an application or data or whatever it is, all of that communication should be going through security checks. And at Menlo Security, we are able to do that in a seamless way for all users across the world through our cloud security platform. So when we talk about a little bit granular and we're a little more deep and specifically on securing remote access, there's still this old versus new approach to handling all that. The first thing on the trust level, right? When we were talking about trust back in the olden days, everybody inside of a network, whether you're actually physically attached to the network, sitting at an office somewhere, or whether you're connected through a VPN, and sort of because you're connected on the VPN, you're considered inside. It's all considered trusted. Everybody inside that network, inside the castle and moat, was a trusted entity. And then, of course, everyone outside that castle moat was untrusted. So that's sort of how the delineation of security layers was defined at that point. But now we think, you should really probably trust no one, honestly, right? I mean, even if you trust me as an employee, for instance, I could have my credentials stolen at any time. If that happens, that's a bad thing, because then, of course, all that the threat actor is doing is acting as if they're me as an employee, and they have access to everything I have access to. And so because of that, we need to really sort of shift our mindset to trusting no one in this new world. Obviously, a big change was remote work. Back in the day, the users were not very many users were remote. 25% of users were remote. And I would say that wasn't even 100% of the time that you had that many. It would be, 10 to 25% of users were at any time remote, right? And so that's sort of how VPN architecture was scaled to meet those demands. Now we're seeing that, up to during the initial phases of COVID, for sure, it was 75% or more of employees were remote, maybe even 100%. Obviously, what that led to was gigantic overload on the VPNs. They were not ever scaled or designed to handle that kind of workload within organizations, and so they sort of fell down. And organizations were rapidly trying to figure out how we can adjust to this new way of working. Now, with things getting a little more stabilized, things getting back to the new normal, that kind of thing, I think you'll see probably less users as fully remote. But I think hybrid work is definitely here to stay. So you on the security teams are definitely going to be thinking about how you can manage this remote worker challenge from here and into the future, more than likely. And then, of course, back in the old days for apps and data, they were all located in that private IP space. Again, think of castle and moat. They were inside that castle. You had all your apps and data inside those castle walls. You had all these security controls around all that information. You had a really tight control around that, which, of course, from a security perspective, we love that, right? We had a lot of ability to make sure that data didn't leak. But as things moved and people started moving and users started moving and apps and data started moving, now data and apps are everywhere. They could still be in your headquarters or data center location. That's for sure. There's companies who have that. But more and more, we're seeing applications and data going into the cloud, and they can be anywhere. And you might not have those full controls over that. You hope that wherever you're hosting these applications or data has obviously strong security around it. But again, you lose some of that security just because you don't have internally the ability to have those tight controls anymore on a lot of this information. So what are some of the challenges when you think about accessing applications in this new world? And you think about a VPN, definitely not a zero trust approach. When we talk about zero trust, everybody's talking about zero trust. But if a VPN was never designed with zero trust in mind, right? I mean, when you think about a VPN architecture, that stuff was built 20, 25 years ago. Zero trust wasn't even something that anybody was talking about back in the day. And so VPNs were not sort of designed to meet those needs. So what happens when you don't have a zero trust approach, right? So the first thing, of course, is sophisticated attacks. So phishing attacks are much more easily able to penetrate perimeter defenses than they used to be able to. And VPNs have a very hard time trying to stop any of that. threat actors from doing those kind of attacks. We're also seeing a very big increase in outsourcing. You might think about it within your organizations today. Not maybe everybody in the organization is a fully badged employee that's gone through all the background checks and all that. You might have third parties or contractors or other folks that need to access applications and or data in your organization, but they're not very, you can't really build a lot of trust around that type of user because you don't have all the checks, you don't manage their devices, you don't manage their networks, any of that, right? And so they need to have access to the applications, but you have a hard time making sure there's security around them simply because you don't have, they're not an employee. And then of course, finally, there's a cloud mobile migration. So we've already discussed this, but applications are moving outside and into the cloud. Again, from a security perspective, it's hard to, you're trying to wrap your minds around how are we going to secure this when the application is no longer directly in my control. From a business perspective, the businesses are trying to do that because there's costs and efficiencies, cost benefits and efficiencies that come with moving to the cloud. And so that's why businesses are trying to do that from a cost perspective. But obviously, as security professionals, we just sort of worry. It sort of keeps us up at night of how are we going to secure these applications when they're not in my data center anymore. So one of the things, of course, that came around this, it's been something that a lot of people have been talking about, but it's only been, a handful of years, probably 3 to 4 years, I think, that ZTNA has sort of been something that organizations and analysts have been talking about. But it is definitely a replacement technology, right? And so this is directly from Gartner, right? Zero Trust Network Access is going to replace traditional VPN technologies that extend excessive trust to employees and partners. And that's obviously a thing around VPNs that you probably know is that VPNs permit excessive trust. I get on my VPN, I basically have access to anything on the corporate network. Do I need access to that? I mean, do I, as a product marketer, someone in that organization, do I need access to Confluence or something my engineering team uses? Probably not. But a VPN has a very hard time providing any kind of granular access. So it's generally excessive access that we are given by VPN, which is problematic. Gartner also says by 2022, which is this year, we're going to see many digital businesses applications opened up to partners, right? So you might think of that in your organization. If you think about, you've got these applications, these proprietary and important business applications, there probably are plans in place to extend the usage of those to third parties, to contractors, to outside individuals. And the way you should probably do that or think about that is through a ZTNA type of approach. And that's what many organizations are thinking about doing. By 2023, we're seeing that 60% of organizations are going to try and phase out much of their VPN architecture. And this is ZTNA is not something that's going to happen overnight, right? So we're going to talk about how Menlo handles some of the ZTNA challenges for you. But I'll tell you that it's not something we can do in a month. It takes planning. Like I said, VPNs have been around for 20 years or whatever it is. So there's a strong infrastructure that's tied to them. And so you just can't flip the switch and move over to a ZTNA solution right away. It'll be a process, but as Gartner mentions here, organizations are looking to do that because they see that the problems that VPNs have, and they want to look to ZTNA as the solution to that, to providing that secure access to applications. And then finally, this bottom stat's a really interesting one from ESG, Enterprise Strategy Group. And they say 83% of organizations will allow employees to use personal devices to access corporate applications and data. And obviously what that happens is, whether that's employees, third parties, or contractors, we're seeing that more and more where organizations are saying, hey, we'll still let you access, you can do your job from whatever maybe device you might have, whether it's a mobile device or whether it's your own laptop or whatever. They'll just sort of give you this access. But obviously, again, thinking from a security perspective, that's problematic. As a security practitioner, you don't have access to that device. You might not have access to my laptop to ensure that it has, AV definitions up to date and a strong, maybe firewall on the device, all that kind of stuff. You don't have access to making sure the device itself is secure. And so if you're just going to let that user on that personal device access apps and data, it incurs some security challenges. And so how do we start locking some of that down? And that's sort of where ZTNA can come into the fold and help with a lot of those challenges. So again, it's around looking at how your organization works, understanding how they do business, and then moving from that implicit trust, right? So implicitly trusting every user and giving them full access to explicit trust. And that goes for everything. That goes for accessing the internet. That goes for accessing applications in the cloud, accessing applications in the data center, but providing explicit trust, all of that based on what we know about that particular user. Because again, remember what I said at the beginning, the user is the new perimeter. So a lot of this stuff has to be tied to that user. That user might change networks. That user might change devices. But if we know what we know about the user, then we can start deploying this explicit trust model around them to making sure they have access to what they need to do their jobs, but offer that in a very secure fashion. And so that's really what Menlo Security offers you with some of our solutions. So what are some of the key use cases? And we'll drill into some of these more in detail in a couple more slides. But obviously, VPN replacement and augmentation is a big one. And I actually like to think more of it on the augmentation side initially. Like I've said, VPNs are not going to be something that I expect organizations to get rid of in the next month. They've been around for so long. It's what everybody knows, so they'll be around. But what I think we can really do with ZTNA type solution like Menlo Private Access is provide augmentation to your existing VPN architecture. Multi-cloud support, again, so this is where data applications can be in multiple cloud instances. It can be in private clouds, public clouds. It can be in your headquarters data center. So being able to provide all that access with a single connection becomes very important. Oops, sorry about that. I skipped ahead too far. Contractor and third-party device access, right? So like we talked about before, you might have users who are not badged employees. How do you provide them secure access to applications to do what they need to do? And then another one that's interesting is mergers and acquisitions. So this is very organizational specific, but if you think about your organization and think about M&A activities they've done or they may do, this becomes a major challenge because trying to get two disparate networks tied together in secure fashion can be very challenging. And so mergers and acquisitions offers an interesting opportunity for ZTNA approach to handling that. I'll just build this out. So this is an interesting one. We're talking to a lot of organizations who are looking at these business critical applications they have that are running. And these business critical applications, like I said, they can reside anywhere in a public or private cloud or in a data center. But what they have a struggle with is maybe not necessarily giving office employees access, right? Because you're connected to the network, you can sort of get access to that. But if you're a remote worker or a third party trying to get access to that, VPNs again are much too permissive, and they're not granular enough to provide specific access to critical business applications. And so one of the use cases we see a lot of organizations looking to is how do you manage that? So it could be things like you think of an insurance agency, for instance. The insurance company themselves has their own set of employees, but they might have third parties who are insurance adjusters who are not badged employees who do insurance adjustment on a car wreck, for instance. And then, of course, you might have me, the buyer of that insurance. If I get in a wreck, I might need to submit documentation to an application. The insurance adjuster might need to submit documentation to the same application. And so generally what you have to do is just have essentially an open website where people can log in and go do that, which of course that gives an attack surface for attackers to go after and start hitting that and trying to bring it down or get in there and create havoc. So if you can create a zero trust approach to doing this with ZTNA, that makes it a much more secure proposition to providing access to those applications. The other one, of course, is accessing internal web applications from unmanaged devices. So if there are intranet applications, again, a VPN would just simply provide all intranet access across the board. It's much too permissive. And so what this allows us to do with the ZTNA approach is to provide, VDI to access internet, or VPN. You can get rid of using VPNs to access the internet, because if you say, hey, this contractor needs access to something on the intranet, we can be very prescriptive and granular with that access they get. So you're not getting access to the full corporate network contractor. You're getting access to a specific thing you need on the internet to do your job, and just that thing. And of course, then you can do things like, if the device changes or whatever else, the context of that user changes, you can deny that access as needed. Like I said, M&A is a really interesting one, right? So this is the kind of thing where you maybe your company acquires another company, but then there are organizational groups that need to work together in applications or with various data. rather than trying to get two completely different IT schemas built and put together and working together, you can deploy very quickly a ZTNA solution and say, based on, let's say the finance groups in both organizations need access to a certain application or data. You can say, okay, I know who those users are. I'm going to provide those users very quick access to those applications and data to do that M&A activity. Or if there's, engineering teams or whatever it is, any kind of teams that need access to this information, you can rapidly expand that and rapidly do that with a ZTNA approach, rather than trying to build up a VPN architecture or scale out the existing architectures and merge them. That can be very time consuming and challenging. And ZTNA makes that much easier. And then, of course, VPN Augmentation Replacement, right? And so this is sort of what we've been talking about. We go over this, but one of the things that we see for augmentation that really helps out here is, rather than backhauling all the traffic through a VPN or whatever to get access to applications and data, you can say, these users need access to these 3 applications. Just give them that access to that application. Don't make them go through a VPN to access this. And so that can really shrink and downsize the capacity requirements for your VPN architecture. So that's why I say, when I talk about a ZTNA approach, whether it's our solution or any of the others that might be out there, I go in there with a VPN augmentation mindset initially and say, we can really help make your existing architecture and investment in that VPN architecture more easily able to scale with what your workers are actually doing. And then as you go forward, of course, you can look at, hey, maybe the ZTNA thing really does work for us. Maybe it's going to be the way we want to have all of our users across the board, no matter what, connecting to applications and data. And so at that point, maybe you look at the replacement of a VPN, but it is a process for sure. It's something that would take some time. I'll continue on. What I would like to say is that I don't have any Q&A yet. So if you have a question about anything that we've been talking about, feel free to pop it in the Q&A, and I can get to that at the end of our session here. So now, how do we do this from a Menlo perspective, right? And so this is Menlo Private Access, and it's one of the things that, like I said, all of the connections and everything from all of our security tools go through our Menlo cloud, right? And that same thing with Menlo Private Access. On the left-hand side, we see user access, right? So users need access to applications and data. And then on the right-hand side, of course, we see private applications. So they need access to those private applications wherever those private applications reside. And when I talk about private applications, I'm talking about stuff like Jira, Confluence, Jenkins, any applications you might have developed internally. If you're looking for things like, O365, G Suite, those are generally managed by CASB, which we also have a CASB, but those kinds of applications are generally managed more by CASB, the public applications, I guess you could say. We're talking really about the private applications that are important to do your job. There are 3 big categories of what we do with that application access. The first is around user security, making sure that there's that tight security around the users accessing the application. We also want to make sure the application is secure. So like I said, with the old use case of an insurance company, they might just have a web portal that's out there and exposed to the world, but we want to lock that down and make sure the application itself is not going to be attacked or a cause of attack within an organization. And then, of course, as we know, applications are tied to data. And so it's very important that we make sure that the data in those applications stays secure as possible. There's a couple keys that we want to talk about within this. The first is that all of this is powered by Isolation Core, which provides us some unique benefits around our ZTNA approach. And I'll sort of talk about that in a little bit in another slide. It's a very easy end user experience. We sort of speak about that as well, but it's really easy for the user to be onboarded and start working within this scenario. And then, of course, we have an integrated management console. So there are obviously other vendors in the space. Many vendors have multiple different management consoles for like maybe their web gateways and CASBs and those sorts of things. And then they have a different one for their ZTNA solution. We have all of that in one management plane. So from a security perspective, from a security practitioner perspective, from an IT team perspective, it makes it much more simple because you don't have to go between multiple consoles to manage policies, get visibility. It's all in one place. So how does it work? Our clientless approach to handling access to applications, right? And so it's quite simple, actually. So what happens is when a user logs in, they're given a URL. to log in, and they get a dashboard. As you see there at step 1, the dashboard looks very similar to what would be an Okta dashboard. It has the applications that have been assigned to that user, and only those applications that have been assigned. They simply click on that user. What happens is as soon as they click, is they go, they're routed through our Menlo Global Cloud, our cloud security platform, to access the application. We have connectors that reside wherever your application resides that establishes that secure communication tunnel. And then obviously the application is then rendered on that user's browser. So again, think of any application you have that users might access. If any application is accessible through a browser window, we would recommend going with a clientless approach because it's easy. You don't have to replace the VPN client and deploy a new client. It's a very easy approach to doing that. And so that's sort of how we handle it with our approach. The interesting thing about this, like you see with the little lines and everything stays within our global cloud. We never have traffic that goes outside of that, which means we can at all times maintain security around that device and application, or around that application and data access. It's always being secured by us. So obviously with the clientless approach that we're talking about here, no agents required. You won't need to do any kind of DNS modifications. Many vendors require that. And obviously there's also no certificate changes required. So it's a very easy sort of zero touch deployment. Now, if you do have applications, SSH, RDP, maybe custom applications that are not browser based, can't open them through a browser, then of course you deploy a client which has a very similar architecture to this. But we think that 80% of a user's day is going to be spent in applications that are browser based, and so being able to provide access simply using this capability is where we would lead off with, and then use the client as needed. Okay, so a couple more slides and then we'll end here. So around securing the application, the important things about this is that application you have that you've exposed to these users is always going to be isolated. So the user is actually isolated from the application because we render that in isolation. They don't really have direct access to that application. We have all kinds of information. We have header sanitization. We do source IP restrictions if needed. But what this does, of course, is this is going to provide, again, specific granular access to that the user needs to access applications for their job. It's going to remove that application from internet risk. So again, we're not going to have that exposure from a web portal, for instance, to access these applications. And of course, the isolation core protects that application from a user, right? So if the user becomes compromised in any way, they're not going to be able to directly access the application to cause damage to the application itself. Okay, securing the data, right? And so this is because we're always in line of traffic, we can actually secure the data that's being transmitted between applications and user. So we can do DLP checks on that information. We can control file uploads and downloads, right? So if you want to make sure that a user can't upload or can't download or both files that are in an application, you can do that very simply because we're always in line. And then you can also provide read-only access. Right? So if you really want to lock it down, let's say you have a contractor who just needs view access to Confluence, you can very easily do that within the policies. So it makes it really easy to make sure that the data within those applications stays as secure as possible. And then finally, securing the users, making sure the user themselves isn't bringing security risk, right? And so some of the cool things we can do here is we can do scans. Again, because we're in line of all this traffic flow, we can actually do sandbox and AV scans of file uploads or downloads to make sure that the content being sent to your application is not malicious in nature, which is a great benefit, right? So if my credentials get compromised, attacker tries to send up some kind of ransomware file into a corporate application, we can scan that in real time to make sure that it's not going to be able to be uploaded. We can also render documents in isolation. So if a user is accessing documents, PDFs, Word documents, what have you, we can render those in isolation so that any kind of malicious content within those documents does not impact the user. And then, of course, we can provide this across an organization very easily. So how many ever users you have, we're going to be able to scale whatever needs you have and provide consistent security policies across all of those users. All right, this is my last slide, so we'll close on this one. I don't appear to have any Q&A, so if there are questions, feel free to ask, and we will have I'll stay on and make sure we have time to answer any of those questions. But what are some of the business benefits of moving to Menlo Private Access? The first we talk about is improved performance, right? If you think about the old legacy VPN and multitudes of users on those VPNs, it was a major scalability issue. And so with our approach to ZTNA, we really help dramatically improve application performance. We remove that centralization that might have been necessary with a VPN architecture. And of course, because of our cloud architecture that exists across the entire globe, we provide scalability for any users, devices, and locations that might need access to those applications. Like I talked about a second ago, we dramatically enhance overall security for your organization. We dramatically lower the threat landscape, the attack surface from application accesses. Of course, we prevent lateral discovery, right? If a user gets compromised and the attacker gets access to VPN credentials, lateral spread of attacks is a major problem. If we just provide them that user direct access to only applications needed to do their job, that lateral discovery and movement is dramatically limited from an attacker's perspective. And of course, we can then obviously, because we have that full connection, real-time scanning, we can do security and DLP checks around all that. We provide your IT teams a lot of flexibility for either unmanaged or managed devices, right? Even if it's a managed device that's not in the corporate network or unmanaged device, we're going to provide flexibility and ease of use for those device types. And then the end user experiences will be consistent. So the end user themselves, again, they'll go to that portal where their applications reside, and it doesn't matter where that application resides. It doesn't matter how they're connecting to that portal. Their usage of that's going to be very consistent across the board. So it makes it easy for the end user. There's not a lot of training needed. It's just like, hey, go to this URL. You're going to have the applications to do your job, and you're on your way. And then finally, ROI, operational ROI, right? We're going to eliminate CapEx. You're not going to have to purchase any kind of hardware. You're not going to have to expand your VPN footprint because it's all managed by us in the cloud. And then, of course, there's that predictable cost across over time. It's not going to fluctuate if workload increases. So if you're, we one of the things that we really push on at Menlo, regardless of how many users are on the system, we're not going to change pricing based on the workload required on our back end. It's all sort of built into the initial license cost. And with that, I think we'll go ahead and end. That's definitely going to end. My slide died on me. There we go. So that's the last slide I had for the day, and I think we're going to have Cody come back and maybe announce one of the, or I guess we have maybe 4 winners for our gift cards. And if there are questions, feel free to ask those while he's doing this, and I'll stay around to answer those.
Perfect. So quickly, we do have 4 gift cards to give away. These are for $25 Amazon gift cards. Our first winner is Bill S. Our second winner is Elaine H. Our third winner is Jesse P. And our fourth and final winner is Ming Y. So keep an eye on your inbox to claim those gift cards. And if you don't see that email, just be sure to check your spam folder. And I'll also take this opportunity to remind our audience that you'll receive an email shortly after we conclude today with a link to access the recording. The recording will also be found on the Security Boulevard website at securityboulevard.com/webinars. So Eric, I'm not seeing any more questions come in. Nope. So any parting thoughts on your end?
No, I would say thanks for your time. ZTNA is definitely a process, right? And there's a lot of vendors out there in the market doing ZTNA stuff. So I would say, look at what your organization is trying to accomplish. We'll have and then come to Menlo. We have a great solution that's going to help you enable that workforce with a ZTNA mindset.
Well, Eric, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us and for putting together this presentation. I would like to thank Menlo for sponsoring today's webinar. And of course, my final thanks, as always, goes to you, our audience. We really appreciate you taking the time to be with us today. Please take a moment to fill out our post-webinar survey, and we hope to see you at a future TechStrong Learning webinar. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.